Greetings, everyone. Thank you for joining us here at St. Nersess Seminary for the third lecture in a series of 6 lectures on Armenian martyrdom. Today and next week's lectures introduce and examine martyrdoms in the Lake Van region, which was the topic of my doctoral dissertation, where the focus was the martyrdom of Katerikos Zakaria II of Akhtamar, in its political, social, and its ecclesiastical context. In this first part, I hope to highlight the virtues and the principle of Anznishchanutsiun, which is the Armenian thought on human free will, as the forces behind the character of the martyr, and essentially adding to our list of understandings of what it means to be human, as deciphered through the figure of the martyr. In other words, the overarching inquiry for me in this investigation has been to draw out the meaning of the human life and death as illuminated in the person of the martyr. So this is lecture 3, and I'm very happy that you all have joined me today, and I hope you enjoy and also draw some important lessons from this stories, which I will share with you today. Last week, I started with St. Stephen's martyrdom in the Acts of the Apostles as a biblical context. Then I introduced Armenian martyrs under Islam, the Islamic rule, looking at 2 cases of charges of apostasy. Under Islamic law, apostasy came to be considered a capital offense. Those who were charged under apostasy faced execution if found guilty. We looked at the martyrdom of Vahan Gochnetsi, who was a Christian, raised Muslim, then returned to Christianity, who was charged with apostasy and executed. Then we looked at the martyrdom of David Devinetsi, who was a Muslim who became a Christian and faced the same fate, charge of apostasy. What we consider a charge of apostasy and a capital offense became a case of martyrdom in the Armenian Christian expression under Islam. I am including links in the previous lectures in the chat for your review. You're welcome to listen to them if you were unable to attend those the last 2 lectures. But today we look at the late medieval Lake Van region, where other martyrdoms and the charge of apostasy appears in a different context. First, considering the martyrdom of Tamar Mokatsi, martyred in Vostan Van in 1398. Then we will look at the martyrdom of Katerikos Zakaria, who was the head of the church, who refused to accept Islam, and the consequences of his choice on the Katerikosate, but also for the Christian community. So this is a brief outline for today's lecture to orient and allow us to follow the lecture for the duration of the talk. As a way of orientation geographically in the late medieval world, here is a map to situate our discussion. Most of my talk today will focus on Eastern Turkey, right in this boxed area, Lake Van region primarily. The very tumultuous period of power contestation in the Lake Van region requires a bit of historical context and a background to these martyrdoms, which will become helpful for us to form a broader picture in our mind. Now, after the demise of the Mongol Ilkhanate Empire in 1335, this is just a bit of history, the region of the empire became a political vacuum until the establishment of the Ottoman Empire in the mid-16th century in the areas we are studying a little earlier in the West. In this quasi-interregnum between one hegemony, that of the Mongol Empire, and the hegemony of the Ottomans and then the Safavids in the 16th century, the Lake Van region underwent a turbulent period of power contestation at 3 major political tiers. Timur Lenk, or Tamerlan, assumed the hemispheric power in the period, who was from Samarkand. He had traveled southwest with ambitions of reestablishing the Mongol Empire. Concurrent to Timur, the second political tier was the regional dimension involving the Turkoman Confederation of the Karakuyunlu. The Karakuyunlu tribe, and some of us may even be familiar with the Akkuyunlu, which is a bit later in the period, but for the most part, for this region, in this period, it's the Karakuyunlu, with their center in Iraq. The third tier, which constituted the local political powers and more immediate influencers of Armenian life, comprised the Kurdish Emirates. At the northwest, southwest, and southeast of the lake. At the local level, it is the Armenian, and I'll highlight that for us here. At the local level, it is the, for the Armenian Christians, it's the Armenian Christian and the Kurdish Muslim interactions that become center stage with the various societal issues. I'm not going to say much more about the political context here. However, you may ask questions during the discussion session on this matter if you wish. Now, we looked at the political. One second, there we go. Okay, we looked at the political, but the religious, monastic, and the ecclesiastical background to this period is informative on multiple fronts. This is a time period where Armenia had lost all of her political state and rule, including the fall of Cilicia in 1375. The only structure informing Armenian faith, culture, and existence were the religious leadership. Particularly, I will be focusing on the Akhtamar Katerikosate and her jurisdiction. I will say a bit more about this when I introduce Katerikos Zakaria during the second half of this lecture. We see here on this map centers of monastic life with a very active manuscript illuminations and productions all throughout the late medieval period, despite of its political turmoil. The red circles, the green boxes are some of the monastic, not all, some of the monastic banks, monasteries. And then the red circles here identify centers of Armenian life, socioeconomic prosperity, centers of creativity, but also places of martyrdom where martyrdom occurred. Now, while this period witnesses calamitous political and social events, on the other hand, the period was illuminative in its theological discourse, its fervent production of texts and ideas in the monastic schools around the Lake Van and in the Sunnic regions. I'm going to focus on the illuminative force of the martyr figure, keeping in mind the setting of the calamitous invasions and the historical context. Here is a closer look of what I have extracted from the map of the regions where martyrdoms around Lake Van took place. The question becomes, how do we know about all these events? Who was responsible in passing it down to us? And where do we come to read about them? So just a moment to look at the map here again, just somewhat representing immediately around the Lake Van region. In the darkest moment of Armenian political and social life, we have a class of Vartapets flourishing in the banks, the monasteries around the Lake Van. The root of this rich history is actually grounded in a bit earlier, the Gladzor University, as it's been known, under Yesai Nechetsi, to which Hovnan Borodnetsi, the first person we meet in this timeline, who was the teacher, who Hovnan Borodnetsi and his teachers belonged to the Gladzor University. Borodnetsi created a rich community of Vartapets, training and guiding them even in the midst of war and invasions. We have colophons that describe their dedication to copying and writing manuscripts as they were moved around in caves and monasteries to find a safe place to continue their work. I'm personally having read about this struggle in the comforts of Western civilized Christian society, it's been very motivating to even be able to go over those hurdles to be able to bring this research for the modern mind. What they had to go through is vividly described in some of the colophons and in the manuscripts of this period. And they have achieved something phenomenal in communicating this information to us today. I have a full lecture on the Vartapids of this period. I simply introduce them here because they are the producers of the texts in this period from which these martyrdoms come to us. Tatevatsi, Jurayetsi were all Khalatetsi, they were all students of Vorodnetsi, and their works serve a great witness to the scriptural and the continuation of the early Christian context as expressions of their fate as it emerged in their present world and culture. So just a moment to again familiarize ourselves with these names. We'll see them again. Hovnam Borodnetsi, Grigor Tatevatsi, Grigor Khalatetsi, Mateusz Jurayetsi, and Tovma Metsopetsi, who wrote the history of this period and writes about many of the Vartapids mentioned here. With this background in mind, we are opening another page in the Haismavurk I introduced during the first lecture, the monologium, or Haismavurk on this day, where the lives of the saints and the martyrs were collected by Grigor Khalatetsi, whom we have met a few times, but we'll learn more about him and his martyrdom next week. Here are two of the oldest copies of the Haismavurk kept in the Matenadenan. In this Haismavurk, we find many martyrdoms, especially in the Lake Van region. I have listed some of them here, which will only be focusing on a few. There are many martyr texts, Vagaya Banutsiunk, this is martyrology, or the study or the text on martyrs, which illuminate the lives of the Armenians in a certain time and place. Today we will learn a bit more about the martyrology of Tamar Mokatsi, which records the story in the following way. So just a brief review of the list. I don't intend to spend too much time on this slide, but just to mention that we'll meet Tamar Mokatsi in a second, and then Katerikos Zakaria and Grigor Terence Khalatetsi next week. But as you can see, there's so many here to actually explore. So Tamar Mokatsi. First, I'm going to introduce the social and political context of Tamar and the martyr text and the story of her martyrdom, and then look at the philosophical and theological implications. Tamar Mokatsi's martyrology records that in the year 1398, on the 24th of April, she was martyred in Bostan. The author introduces Tamar in the context of a time when, quote, evil and hardship were prevalent and the community was exhausted of all goodness and depleted of all deeds of virtue, close quote. Tamar is described as a beautiful and desirable woman, an Armenian Christian from Mok, who was married to a Christian man named Tovma. Here we see Tamar's vulnerability already in the context of an Islamic society, namely, it's her beauty and as a female, beautiful woman. A certain Muslim Kurd, unnamed in the text, also from the province of Mok, is described as to having devised a plan to realize his unbecoming desire for Tamar. Motivated by Tamar's beauty and her physical attraction and his physical attraction for her, the Kurd makes an arrangement to kidnap Tamar and to kill her husband. Immediately, the author clues in Tamar's frailty, which would signal her out in an Islamic society where a Muslim man could have 4 wives. Tamar, as an underclass, beautiful woman, is fragile and vulnerable in this context. When Tamar learns about the Kurds' plans, she informs her husband. They take their children and flee to the island of Akhtamar. We know that Akhtamar Island served as a protective enclave for Armenian Christians until its demise in 1898. While on the island, Tamar's narrative resumes that after 4 or 5 years had passed in the April of 1398, Tamar and Tovma leave the island for the city of Bostan to obtain some necessary materials, presumably rations that were not available on the island. And this is literally 15 kilometers in distance, not too far. Upon their arrival in Bostan, some Kurds in the city recognized Tamar from her previous interactions with the Kurd, who had desired to take her as his wife and kill her husband Tovma. Upon recognizing Tamar, these Kurds, unspecified in number but presented as a cluster, plot for her arrest and bring her before the Amir, Izaldin Shir, and his wife Pasha Khatun for arraignment, stating the following: this woman at one point became a Muslim. Furthermore, in addition to the false charge of apostasy, again, recognizing this as an apostasy charge brought against Tamar, this group of Kurds also present false witnesses to confirm their allegation against Tamar, namely that she was an apostate. Now, Pasha Khatun, who presided over Tamar's case, made attempts to win Tamar over with kindness by offering Tamar her freedom if she would renounce her Christian faith and turn to Islam. When Tamar refuses this offer, Pasha Khatun threatens to subject her to grievous tortures and to make her death an excruciating one, only if she would make such a renunciation. However, Tamar remains firm in her conviction before the authorities. After Pasha Khatun's attempt to mediate Tamar's case, she transfers her to the custody of the Qadi. This is the Muslim judge for sentencing. The Qadi sentenced Tamar to serve a 10-day sentence without food or water to induce her to meet their demands. Because Tamar did not convert, the Qadi pronounced the sentence for her to be taken outside of the city and to be killed by stoning. So I had highlighted this last week in St. Stephen's martyr text in the Bible, where we see this sort of literary trope of taking them outside of the city for stoning. I think that's interesting to highlight here. During Tamar's imprisonment, the text introduces a group of Danuders who came together from Bostan in an attempt to purchase Tamar's freedom from Pasha Khatun, yet without success. Finally, the text describes the way the executioners killed Tamar by stoning. There's a lot here I could highlight in terms of identifying the social and socioeconomic aspects of the history, but that's not my point for this lecture. But just to say that the martyr text is very rich and it can be treated in many ways. The issue in Tamar's case is the charge of apostasy trumped up by witnesses, by false present witnesses. And according to Islamic law, also known as Sharia, the penalty for apostasy is death by stoning. The main issue here, besides the societal inequality, it is the issue where the juridical system did not question whether the accusation is trumped up by actual valid testimony, primarily because the Muslim testimony outweighs Christian testimony in Islamic courts. I would like to add that we do see apostasy cases that are not trumped up, even in this period, as we saw 2 cases last week. And each case presents different issues to assess. Overall, the juridical system in Islam, with some variations in different places and different times, gives priority to Muslim testimony. Now, with all this in mind, I'd like to move to the more theological and philosophical approach to Tamar's text. Now, even with the conventions of the genre of martyrological texts, martyr texts in the Armenian tradition elevate the human will and character of self-governance as something the martyr achieves in how the author represents their choices, their active choices, in the things they say and do, as described in the text. Now that we have the martyrdom event in mind, let's return to the preface of the text. In the preface of the martyrology, the author attributes agency to each character to further examine the function of the human free will and how the will influenced by good or evil unfolds in a person's words, in their actions, and in their decisions. Ultimately, the author finds that Tamar Mokatsi, her obedient will and faith, were the fruits of divine love. Now, divine love is a major theme in martyrological writings, and perhaps one that could be explored again in the future, highlighting the richness of how these texts were composed. In other words, the author displays that the one who possesses anznishchanutyun, i.e., the ability to govern the self, is capable of exercising her will freely, whether for good or for evil. He explains that those who find themselves under the influence of good are those who have chosen to kindle the fire of divine love in their souls. Thus, they have chosen to part ways from the ease of the life, essentially the ease of this life. The author attributes numerous virtues to those who choose to do well, further expanding and enriching their toolkit for the ability to choose to do good versus evil. As the preface highlights the qualities of the one who is Anznishchan, the latter part of the text displaying how Tamar is the one who embodies this in principle in her words, actions, and choices. Eventually, Tamar excelled in the virtue of courage to the point of martyrdom. Tamar fully exemplifies what it means to be Anznishchan, possessing the full ability to bridge human rationality and responsibility within the limits of a certain context, space and time, in this case, in the context of her martyrdom, as she is displayed in her, how she chooses her words, her decisions, and her actions. Now, the idea that accumulation of one's prior free choices and the patterns that emerge from those choices shapes one's character and prove direction for future actions is observed in Tamar's case. But I like to say one or two more words about this Anznishchanutyun as a concept, because it's not just only in martyr texts that we see this in this time period. Hovan Borodnetsi, who we met just a few slides earlier, develops this in the same time period. He raises this question of what does it mean to be Anznishchan, and how does the author, in this case, in Tamar's case, exemplify those qualities. Anznishchanutyun, as understood in late medieval Armenian texts, first assumes that humanity was created in the image and the likeness of God. The Armenian theologian Hovnan Borodnetsi, and also philosopher, distinguishes three elements of Anznishchanutyun in his writings. The elements of Anznishchanutyun are the ability to govern the self, that he explores, we have a plane, that he explores are first the contrast of the influence of good and evil as it's manifested in the person's words, actions, and deeds, which we saw with Tamar. The second is the relationship between rationality and responsibility in a person's words, actions, and deeds, also personified and observed in Tamar's, and the limits that confine a person in their enactment of words, actions, and deeds, i.e. their space and time, which we also see Tamar in her context of the Islamic courts, but also before that, as she's accused, and even before that, as she is in the position where there's an attempt on her life for kidnapping. So in all of those cases, the philosophical idea of how Ansnishvanutsun was understood and developed in this period is nicely tied in and brought in to personify and exemplify in the martyr figure, Tamar Mokatsin. One quick highlight, and then I'm going to move into Katerikos Zakaria. It's interesting that it's a noteworthy parallel that in the Armenian Church liturgical confession, the confessor owns responsibility in their choskov, banov, yet gorsov, so in the thoughts and the words and the actions in preparation of Holy Communion. So it's no surprise that the martyr figure is the one who is self-governing in this way, exemplified through the example of this text. Now, we learn in Tamar's case a bit about the role of Achtaman Island for the Christian life in this period. Due to the flourishing of the compositions by the Vartapets, and not only their texts, but also the life of the Vartapets themselves in this period, we know more about Achtamar and the Katerikoseit. Now, I would like to introduce Katerikos Zakaria II and his role and witness in Armenian Christianity and martyrdom. I'm going to start introducing Zakaria today, and we'll explore second aspect of his martyr text next week. Now on this slide, I have the oldest manuscript on Zacharias's martyrdom to our left, if you're looking on the screen to our left. And it's part of the manuscript of the Haismavurk I introduced earlier a few slides ago. And this is just turning another page in the Haismavurk to learn about this event and the life of Zakaria. But before looking at it more closely, please allow me to give a bit more background. So within 1 year, two Katholikoi of the Armenian Church, Katerikos Theodoros of Sis in Cilicia and Katerikos Zakaria of Achtaman were martyred. The two leaders representing the entire Armenian population were killed between the years of 1392 and 1393, less than a year apart from each other. Grigor Vartapet Khalatetsi, whom we've already met, composes his historical lament, a particular genre in Armenian literature, where he highlights the major catastrophe that these two events created for the Armenian church and people. He describes the church as headless, painting an image of a body without a head. This was catastrophic even more so because at this juncture, as mentioned a few slides ago, Armenia had no secular power. Cilicia had fallen in 1375, and the demise of the house of Artsunik in the Greater Armenia in the year 1021. So existentially, this was a major calamity for the Armenian Christian population and the Armenian population at large. Now, to put things into perspective, Katerikos Zakaria, with saying a bit more about Katerikos Zakarias' role, in the 14th century, there were seven clusters of villages with 193 churches and 41 monasteries. This is so during Zacharias' time, that were governed and served by the Ahtamar Catholic state. Now, only just a century before, there were 70 plus monasteries. So ever since the demise in 1021, and also in 1375, there's a significant decrease in the monastery buildings per se. Now, with that context, I'd like to look at Zacharias' martyrdom. And today, my aim is to look at the preface and introduce, this is my translation, working on the right of the slide. And then next week, we can look at a little bit more of the event and then further implications of how martyrdom was understood in this time period. So opening another page in the Heis Maburg, we read Zacharias' martyr text, and it says, and I'll read the slide with you, and feel free to follow. There we go. So it opens off with these words. The one who is evil from the beginning, Satan, saw that our holy patriarch, Lord Zachariah, burning in divine love, had been placed as a torch, bright and luminous, on the lampstand of faith, whence he, Zachariah, made the rays of the beams of his worship of God shine with 7 wicks, that is to say, the 7 virtues of his being. First, because he was perfect through his Orthodox faith. Second, he was assured by the hope of the eternal life to come in the eternal judgment. Moreover, third, he was fervent with love, in no way lacking, that he had towards God and towards people. He was adorned with prudence and distinguished with courage. He was sober-minded in his desires and balanced in his sense of justice. With such 7-fold illumination, had he kindled the lamps on the rock of the lampstand, according to the theologizing of his namesake prophet. This is Prophet Zechariah, as we know in the Old Testament. Such a bright torch Satan desired to extinguish. Now, because today's lecture, I want to highlight the theological and the philosophical understanding of martyrdom in the period. I will focus on the virtues introduced in the text. It's interesting just to highlight also the 7-branch lampstand, which becomes very important in understanding the illuminative power of the Christian faith in this time period. I mentioned here in this previous slide, it was my study and discovery as I put these texts together in this period for the doctoral thesis, where I drew the understanding together of how martyrdom was understood as an illumination, an apologetic, which is what we will look at next week, and an imitation, the manutzion in the Armenian, of the resemblance of Christ's light in the martyr, in the figure of the martyr. So if you could imagine a prism, so the martyr essentially becomes a prism through which the character, the virtuous character, is then exemplified. And we'll explore a bit more of that in the coming lecture. So briefly, just to revisit the virtues in Zacharias' text. First, Zachariah was perfect by his faith. Second, he was firm in his hope. Third, he was fervent with love, lacking in nothing. And he had this love towards God and people. It's interesting to create that intersection, that is, to love people first. The person is connected to God. Moreover, he was adorned with prudence. and distinguished with courage. And he was sober-minded in his desire and balanced in his justice. There is a commentary from Sakish Nurhali that's often copied in this period, particularly by Grigor Khalatetsi, which commentating on the virtues, he says this very line, virtues are the feet you use to walk in the path of goodness. Again, bringing about that idea of responsibility and rationality, and also the fullness of what it means to be a human in our words, in our actions, in our decisions. So how did a martyr become the person who exhibits such characteristics? Now, the force behind the martyr's character is arakinutsiun. This is the virtues, which are the traits that empowers the martyr to give direction to their choices and reactions in the challenging circumstances. So the martyrs crowned as Ansnishkhan and Arakini rose to the occasion and embraced martyrdom when they were faced with the ultimatum to betray or denounce their way of life as Christians, which was informed by where their faith, hope, and love was actually placed in. Zacharias's martyr text explains this in a bit more detail. The author prefaces Zacharias's text with these virtues and then contrasts that to a person in his martyr text, in this case with the Qadi, which we will meet next week, who does not actually exemplify the virtues, but the opposite, that is the vices, which is the vices of deceit and also envy. So I'd like to now close this lecture with the focus on this idea of the virtue, with Nurhali's quote again, that virtues are the feet we use to walk in the path of goodness. With a brief overview and a very quick summary, today we met Tamar Mokadzi, martyred in 1398, and briefly introduced Kateriko Zakaria, who was the head of the Akhtamar Church and was martyred in 1393. And next week, I hope to continue with Zacharias's martyr text, introducing how there was the apologetic component to his martyrdom, and how the idea of being a witness and defending Christian faith in words, but also in deeds, are fully brought together in the life of Zakaria through the compositions of the Bartapets of that period, namely Matthäus Troyetsi, and also concluding with the life and the martyrology of Grigor Khalatetsi, who was also the compiler of the Haismavurk. With that, I want to thank you for listening, and now I would like to open up for questions and discussion.